Welcome to Eerie Shadow. I still remember the way she looked. Skin pallid, almost grayish, like something left too long in the cold. Her hollowed-out eyes sat deep within her face, sunken and shadowed, as if they had seen things no one should ever witness. And her frame, thin, almost brittle, like a marionette wrapped in an old cardigan that smelled of dust and decay. She introduced herself as Ms. Langley. By the time the day was over, I knew something was terribly wrong. My name is Jenna, and I was in my senior year when it happened. A normal day at school turned into something I still can't explain. Something that haunts me to this day. It started like any other morning. Thick humidity hung in the air, clinging to skin like a second layer. Students filled the halls of West Hollow High, their voices a chaotic blend of chatter, laughter, and the occasional slamming of lockers. When I walked into room 206, my best friend Rachel was already in her seat, head bowed, scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up, but her voice was hushed, tense. "Did you hear?" she murmured, leaning closer. "Hear what? Mr. Brighton's out sick." Our English teacher, Mr. Brighton, was strict but fair. If he was out, today would either be an easy one or a nightmare. At exactly 8 a.m., she walked in. Ms. Langley. The moment she entered, something shifted. The air in the room grew colder. Not just a draft or a trick of the AC. This was something else. A bone-deep chill, creeping under the skin, curling around the spine. Her presence carried a quiet authority, yet something about her was off. The way she moved, too smooth, almost gliding. The way she never blinked. The way shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch just a little too long. She placed a worn leather bag on the desk, fingers moving with slow, deliberate precision. Her hands were pale, almost translucent, veins like dark rivers beneath the skin. She pulled out a faded, crumpled attendance sheet. Her voice was flat, lifeless, each syllable carefully measured, devoid of any warmth. "Jenna Carter," I swallowed. A cold prickle ran down my spine. "Here," I answered, my own voice quieter than I intended. Everything about the class was normal at first. She handed out an assignment, her instructions precise but devoid of emotion. The only strange thing was how still she was. She didn't fidget, didn't shift, didn't even glance away. She only moved when she wrote something down in a tattered old notebook. And then the weird things began. Halfway through the lesson, Rachel tapped my arm. "Jenna," she whispered. Her voice trembled. I turned. Her eyes were locked on Ms. Langley. "What is it?" I whispered back. Rachel swallowed. "She doesn't blink at all." I turned my head slightly, just enough to observe. Rachel was right. Ms. Langley stood at the front of the room, posture rigid, almost unnatural, and her eyes wide, unmoving, watching. A creeping unease curled in my stomach. A few minutes later, Kyle, the class clown, raised his hand, breaking the suffocating silence. Ms. Langley, can I use the restroom?" Her head turned too slowly, too smoothly. Her lips parted, but her voice felt wrong, distant, as if coming from somewhere far away. "You may go." Kyle grabbed his pass and hurried out. He never came back. By the end of the period, the tension in the room was unbearable. When the bell rang, we bolted. At lunch, we found Kyle sitting alone. His face was drained of color, his hands trembled against the table. "What's wrong with you?" Rachel asked, sliding into the seat across from him. Kyle's eyes darted up, wide, unfocused. He looked lost. I don't know," he stammered. His voice was barely above a whisper. I frowned. "What do you mean?" Kyle swallowed hard. "I got up, left the room, and then..." A pause. Then his voice dropped to a breathless whisper. "Nothing. I don't remember where I went." The cafeteria felt suddenly too loud, too bright, like the world was moving on without us while we sat in a frozen moment of realization. Rachel and I exchanged a glance. Something was very, very wrong. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but something about Ms. Langley gnawed at me. When the last bell rang, I exhaled, relieved. At least she was gone now, or so I thought. The next morning, we stepped into room 206 and froze. Mr. Brighton sat at his desk, perfectly fine. He looked up, smiling. "Good morning, class." Rachel stiffened beside me, my heart pounded. "How are you feeling, Mr. Brighton?" I asked hesitantly. He frowned. "Feeling I'm perfectly fine." His voice was light, too casual. "But you were out sick yesterday," Rachel said, her voice shaky. Mr. Brighton chuckled. "Yesterday I wasn't sick." The air in the room seemed to shift. The class murmured. Kyle's chair scraped against the floor. "We had a substitute," he blurted out. His voice wavered. Mr. Brighton's smile faltered. "A substitute?" He shook his head. "I never requested one." Silence. A sickening, heavy, suffocating silence. After class, we rushed to the office. Rachel's hands gripped the counter, knuckles white. "Who was our substitute teacher yesterday?" she asked. The secretary gave us a puzzled look. "There was no substitute," she said. I felt my stomach drop. Rachel shook her head. "No, we had someone, Ms. Langley." The secretary frowned. "We don't have a Ms. Langley on our list of substitutes." Then she pulled out a ledger. She slid it across the desk. "Look for yourself. No substitute was recorded." Ice crawled through my veins. Rachel's breathing hitched. "But we all saw her," she whispered. "She took attendance. She gave us assignments. We sat in that room with her for an hour." The secretary's expression flickered. Something uneasy passed over her face. "Maybe you were mistaken." But we were. We knew what we saw. We knew we weren't alone in that room. Later that night, curiosity got the better of me. I searched the school archives. I found it. An old faculty photo taken in 1982. There she was, Ms. Langley, pale, hollow-eyed, wrapped in that same outdated cardigan. But beneath the photo, the caption read, "Ms. Rosie Langley, 1954 to 1982, passed away in room 206, West Hollow High." I dropped the photo. My hands shook. We had spent an entire day with someone who wasn't supposed to exist. A substitute. That no one hired. I swear she was right there. One second she was walking in, laughing, tossing a joke over her shoulder, and then gone. Justine never came out of that bathroom. No one saw her leave, but no one saw her inside either. If I didn't have her phone in my hands, still recording, I might have started believing she never existed at all. The food court was a chaotic mess of voices and movement, the air thick with the mingling scents of greasy fries, artificial butter, and sugary sodas. The sound of a baby wailing blended into the distant hum of a blender at the smoothie stand. Justine and I had been dragging ourselves from store to store for nearly 2 hours, our arms loaded with shopping bags, when she suddenly groaned and shifted uncomfortably. "I swear I'm about to explode," she muttered, pressing a hand to her stomach. "Wait for me." I rolled my eyes, already fishing my phone from my pocket. Yeah, go pee before you flood the whole mall." She laughed, a quick, breathy sound, and pushed open the door to the women's restroom. The heavy metal door swung inward, then slowly creaked shut behind her, cutting off the burst of air conditioning from inside. I barely paid attention at first, lost in the glow of my phone's screen, scrolling through TikTok with half-interest. Time slipped by unnoticed, swallowed by the blur of passing videos and muffled conversations around me. Then I realized too many minutes had passed. I frowned, glancing up at the restroom door. The flow of customers hadn't stopped. People were still coming and going, yet Justine hadn't come out. I knocked. "Hey, you fall in!" Silence. A faint prickle of unease crawled up my arms. I pushed the door open, stepping inside. The restroom was empty. The air vent hummed softly overhead, its rhythmic drone filling the stillness. The walls, a sickly off-white, gleamed under the dim fluorescent lights, flickering slightly as though struggling to stay on. The chemical sting of industrial cleaner burned in my nostrils, mixing with the cloying scent of artificial lavender. "Justine!" My voice echoed slightly against the tiled walls, bouncing back at me. No answer. I moved deeper inside, my footsteps unnaturally loud against the tiles. The stalls stood in a neat row, all doors closed. A sense of wrongness settled in my gut, thick, pressing, irrational, but undeniable. I hesitated, then crouched, checking for feet under the stall doors. Nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck lifted. I swallowed hard and reached for my phone, my fingers shaking slightly as I called her number. The ringtone shattered the silence. It blared from the farthest stall, the cheery, familiar tune piercing the still air. Loud. Close. My pulse pounded against my ribs as I took slow, measured steps toward the stall. The door loomed ahead, dull gray, slightly ajar. The bathroom was cold, unnaturally so, and yet sweat slicked my palms. I knocked. No response. I pushed. The door swung open easily, the hinges emitting a soft creak. The stall was empty. No Justine. No sign that anyone had been there at all, except for her phone. It sat perfectly centered on the closed toilet lid, screen glowing, still unlocked, still recording. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, a sick sense of dread curling in my stomach. Recording what? I clutched Justine's phone, my fingers ice-cold and slick with sweat. The weight of it felt unnatural in my palm, as if the device itself had absorbed the wrongness of whatever had happened here. The screen's glow cast a faint blue light against my trembling hands, the timer at the top reading 0712. I shouldn't watch this. Every instinct screamed at me to put the phone down, to walk out, to run. But I pressed play. Justine's face filled the screen, grinning, her playful eyes crinkling as she stuck out her tongue in a goofy bathroom break expression. The sound of her laugh, so normal, so alive, made my chest tighten. She propped the phone against something, angling it just right, and turned away, humming softly as she unzipped her jeans. Then the first sign of something wrong. The stall door rattled, a sharp, jarring movement. Justine barely reacted, just rolled her eyes. "Occupied," she huffed, her voice light, annoyed. The rattling stopped instantly, but something else started. A whisper, soft, garbled, too faint to make out, but unmistakably inside the stall with her. Justine froze. I saw it in her posture, in the way her shoulders stiffened, her breath hitched. "Hello?" she asked, voice uncertain, low. She hesitated, then grabbed the phone, her fingers covering part of the lens as she swiveled it toward the stall's corner. The camera adjusted, refocused. Nothing but sterile white tile, a faint shadow cast by the dim fluorescent lights. For a second, nothing happened. Blackness. The video jerked, a blur of movement, the lens spiraling into chaos. A muffled gasp, a sharp thud, something heavy slamming against the stall wall. Then silence. The phone must have slipped from Justine's grip because the last frame was tilted, angled toward the door as it slowly, eerily swung open. Nothing stood on the other side. No Justine. No one. The recording ended. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. The restroom around me, so empty, felt like it was pressing in, the air thick and heavy. The walls seemed closer. The stall door at the end, the one that had been closed just moments ago, it was open now, and it was waiting. Panic twisted in my gut, sharp and breathless, as I stood frozen in my dimly lit room. The glow of Justine's phone felt unnatural, like a tiny window into something I was never meant to see. The notification still hovered at the top of the screen, one unread video. I swallowed, my throat tight, my pulse hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. With shaking fingers, I tapped the file. The screen stayed black for a long, agonizing moment. I almost thought it was broken, just another cruel trick, another sign that my mind was unraveling. But then, through the silence, something crackled, a whisper. "Help me!" A voice so faint, so fragile that it barely rose above the static hum. Justine. I recoiled, nearly dropping the phone. My skin prickled, a cold sweat breaking out along my spine. The voice wasn't normal, it carried a distortion, something just off enough to make my stomach churn. The way her words stretched like they had been pulled through water, like she was speaking from somewhere impossibly far away. The video ended. No image, no movement, just darkness. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring. My breath came in short, uneven gasps. This wasn't just a nightmare, this wasn't my imagination. Justine had been here, she had spoken. But from where? From what? My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Did you watch it?" I clapped a hand over my mouth, stifling a scream. My fingers hovered over the reply button, but I had no words. My reflection in the darkened screen stared back at me, wide-eyed, trembling. Then, beneath my reflection, a second pair of eyes, watching. The air inside Blackwood always felt too still, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The place smelled sterile, but beneath the sharp tang of antiseptic lurked something deeper, the weight of time, of restless minds left to unravel in dim-lit rooms. I wasn't nervous. Not yet. But when my fingers brushed against the worn edges of the file, a prickle of unease traced my spine. No name, no history. Just 2 warnings written in ink that had faded but never quite disappeared. Do not transfer. Do not remove. I felt watched then, though the nurse's station was empty. A chill seeped through me as I shifted my grip on the folder, the paper dry but strangely heavy, as if it carried more than just words. "Bella!" Dr. Morris's voice made me start. I turned quickly, clutching the file tighter than I meant to. He stood under the sickly flicker of the hallway lights, deep lines creasing his face. The man had been working here for decades, long enough that his presence should have been reassuring. But the way he looked at the folder in my hands, like it was something dangerous, made my skin crawl. "You don't need to worry about 304. His tone was firm, final. "But there's no information. He's been here a long time," Morris cut in, his voice low. "Just stick to your rounds." Then, after a pause, he added, "And don't go into room 17. The air seemed to grow colder around us. I nodded, but something about the way he said it unsettled me. Midnight at Blackwood felt different, thicker. The air clung to my skin, damp and unmoving, as if the building itself was reluctant to let go of the night. My footsteps echoed down the empty corridor, the sharp squeak of my shoes breaking the silence, too loud, too alone. Most of the patients were asleep, their restless murmurs blending into the low hum of fluorescent lights. But as I neared room 17, the sound changed. A faint, rhythmic sobbing. My breath hitched. I hesitated, glancing down at the clipboard in my hands. Patient 304, the nameless one, the one with no history. The door was locked. I should have kept walking. I should have ignored it. But as I stood there, the sobbing stopped. The lock slid open on its own. A cold shiver trickled down my spine. I hesitated, but the darkness inside pulled at me, silent and expectant. The beam of my flashlight cut through the room, except there was no room, no bed, no furniture. Just 4 walls of raw, lifeless cement. This wasn't a patient's room. It was something else, something wrong. The air inside felt different, thick, suffocating, charged with something unseen. It pressed against my chest, and a slow, crawling dread whispered at the back of my mind. I wasn't alone. "Why did you come here?" The voice was soft, too soft. But it didn't come from any one direction. It came from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet. I spun around, my breath sharp, my pulse hammering in my ears. No one was there. I bolted, and the door slammed shut behind me. I didn't sleep after that. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The voice, soft, patient, waiting. By morning, exhaustion had settled deep in my bones, but I needed answers. I spent hours in the records room, sifting through dusty files, brittle pages, ink faded with time. But there was nothing. No admission history, no medical records. Patient 304 didn't exist. Then I found the therapy tapes. A plain, unmarked box. Old cassette reels covered in a layer of dust, their labels scrawled in shaky handwriting. The dates stretched back over 40 years, some so faded I could barely read them. I swallowed hard and loaded the earliest tape into the player. Static. Suddenly, a voice, Dr. Morris, younger, clearer. "Tell me your name." Silence. "You've been here a long time." A faint rustling, like fabric shifting against fabric. Then a low chuckle, not amused, not friendly. Then words that sent ice spilling down my spine. "I was here before you, and I'll be here after." I stopped the tape. My hands were trembling. That afternoon, I confronted Morris. "There's no record of him," I said, slapping the file down on his desk. "No name, no background, just that room." Morris didn't look surprised. He didn't even look at the file. He just sighed, rubbing his temples. "You need to drop this." I didn't back down. "Who is he?" His jaw tightened. His face looked paler than usual. Finally, he leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was never admitted." A cold weight settled in my stomach. "Then why is he here?" Morris held my gaze, his expression unreadable. "Quietly, because he won't leave." That night, I returned to room 17. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. No distant voices, no soft shuffle of footsteps from the night staff. Just the faint hum of the overhead lights, their glow casting long, sterile shadows along the walls. I told myself I was imagining things. That exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But as I stood outside the door, I heard it, breathing, slow, uneven, right beside me. I stiffened, every nerve in my body on edge. My fingers fumbled for my flashlight, but when I clicked the switch, nothing. The air inside the room was different. Thicker, heavier. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones, clung to your skin. A touch, light, just a whisper of pressure against my arm. I jerked back, my breath catching in my throat. Then a voice barely above a whisper. "Help me!" I didn't stop to think. I ran, straight back to my office, slamming the door behind me, heart hammering so hard it drowned out the silence. My hands shook as I pulled up the security footage. I replayed the last 5 minutes. The hallway, empty. Room 17, empty. No one had been there. The next morning, I went straight to Morris's office. But it was empty. His desk was cleared out. No papers, no books, no coffee cup he always left behind. His nameplate was gone. I asked the nurses. They frowned, shaking their heads. No one remembered a Dr. Morris. I checked the patient records. Patient 304 was gone. No files, no history, the therapy tapes, missing. As if none of it had ever existed. By noon, I had written my resignation. I didn't tell anyone the real reason I was leaving. What would I even say? Because sometimes people don't just disappear. They are erased. The weight of the shovel in my hands was familiar, comforting even. I had spent more years digging graves than I cared to count, and the rhythm of it, the scrape of metal against soil, the soft crumble of earth giving way, was second nature to me. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, staining the sky in deep purples and dying embers, an unease settled in my chest. We weren't supposed to start exhumations at night. That was just common sense. Families wanted their loved ones moved during the day, under the watchful eye of the church. Not in the cold silence of a cemetery after dark. Mang Lito didn't seem to care. He worked methodically, cigarette still dangling from his lips, the ember glowing faintly in the dim light of our lanterns. The only sound was the steady crunch of dirt being overturned. And then, a dull, hollow thunk. We hit the coffin. I wiped the sweat from my brow, breathing heavily as I leaned on my shovel. Something about the air felt thicker now, heavier, like the earth itself was reluctant to let go of what was buried beneath it. We cleared the rest of the dirt quickly, revealing the old wooden casket. The wood was rotting, blackened with time and moisture. I expected to see the nameplate, a simple engraving marking the identity of the deceased. But there was nothing. No name. No dates. Just bare, unmarked wood. I glanced at Mang Lito, but he only grunted. "Let's get this over with." The crowbar screeched against the wood as he wedged it into the lid. With a sharp crack, the coffin finally gave way, and the smell hit us like a physical blow. It wasn't just the damp, moldy scent of decay. It was worse. Stagnant, almost wrong. Like something that had never been meant to be uncovered. I gagged, turning my face away as the lantern's glow illuminated the inside of the coffin, and my stomach twisted into a knot. The bones inside weren't arranged like they should have been. The skull wasn't resting neatly on top of the ribcage. The limbs weren't folded with care. They were scattered, twisted like something had thrashed inside before it finally stopped moving. The worst part, the scratches. The inside of the lid, deep, ragged gouges in the wood, running from one end to the other. I stared at them, my throat dry. Someone had been buried alive. Mang Lito let out a slow breath. "This ain't right." His voice was quieter now, almost uncertain. I wanted to cover it back up. To fill the grave and pretend we had never seen it. But before I could move, something in the trees rustled. Not the wind, something watching. I turned sharply, my lantern swinging in the dark. The graves cast long shadows, their edges shifting with the flickering light, and then I saw it. A shape. Standing between the tombstones, too still, too silent, my breath hitched. My pulse pounded in my ears. The lantern's glow barely reached it, but I could see enough. A figure thin, its head slightly tilted, its face obscured by the dark, but its hands were curled, clawed, and caked in dirt. I stumbled backward, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. Mang, Leto! But when I turned, he was already running. The night air turned frigid in an instant, the damp fog clinging to my skin like unseen fingers. My breath came out in shallow, uneven puffs as my heart hammered against my ribs. I could still feel the weight of the shovel in my grip, but my hands had gone cold, fingers numb. I locked eyes with Nestor. His face, usually unreadable, had gone pale. The lantern between us flickered, its weak flame casting warped shadows over the open grave. I swallowed, my throat tight. Maybe the noise had come from something shifting below. The woods settling. A trick of the wind, then it came again. Knock. Louder. The sound didn't belong there. It wasn't the groan of old wood or the creak of shifting earth. It was deliberate, intentional. Nestor staggered back, his breath hitching. No, he whispered, shaking his head. That's not. Before he could finish, the coffin lurched. The entire thing shifted in the dirt. I choked on a gasp, scrambling away from the edge of the grave. My foot caught on a loose rock, and I nearly fell backward, barely keeping my balance. The shovel slipped from my grasp, clattering against the exposed wood. The knock came again, faster now, more frantic. Thud, thud, thud. Like fists slamming against the lid. No, that wasn't possible. The grave was 50 years old. Whoever was buried inside had long turned to bone and dust, but something inside was moving. I forced myself to step forward, peering into the grave. The lantern's glow wavered over the scratched lid. Nestor was muttering under his breath, his hands trembling at his sides. We shouldn't have dug it up, we shouldn't have. Then, in the dead silence between our ragged breaths, a voice, muffled, weak, but there. Help me. My stomach dropped, I couldn't breathe. The words, so fragile, so strained, curled through the damp night air like smoke. Then something scraped inside the coffin. A slow, dragging sound like fingernails against wood. I felt bile rise in my throat. The weight of the fog pressed heavier against my skin. This was wrong. This was so wrong. Nestor took a step back. I'm getting Mang Leto, he stammered, his voice breaking. I'm not staying here. He turned on his heel and bolted into the mist. I wanted to run too. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to go, to leave this grave open and pretend I never saw it. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Because as I stood there, heart pounding, breath ragged, the coffin lid shifted just an inch, just enough to let a sliver of darkness seep through the cracks. And then the whisper, right behind me. You should not have come. A scream lodged itself in my throat, but no sound came out. My muscles locked, my heartbeat a frantic hammering in my ears. The air around me thickened, pressing against my lungs, making every breath feel like drowning. Nestor stumbled back with a strangled cry, his boots scraping against loose dirt. No. His voice was breaking, his panic raw, but I couldn't move, I couldn't look away. The corpse, no, the thing inside the coffin stared up at me, its eyes dull and sunken, yet unmistakably alive. Not alive in the way a person should be, but aware. Watching. Waiting. The breath I had just heard, a slow, rattling inhale, came again like air being pulled through a broken instrument. Its ribs barely moved, but I saw it. I saw it breathe. The silence was unbearable, stretching between us, thick and suffocating. Then the lips twitched, a slow, cracking movement, too stiff, too unnatural, like something learning how to use a face again. A gurgling sound bubbled from its throat, wet and clotted, the kind of sound a body should not be making after days, maybe even hours underground. The fingers, the same ones that had been reduced to ragged stumps, moved. They twitched once, then again. I took a step back, my breath coming in short, broken gasps. My mind refused to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't just wrong. This wasn't possible. Nestor was already moving. I barely registered the sound of his panicked footsteps as he bolted for the gate, his shovel forgotten. I wanted to run, too. I should have run. But my body remained frozen at the edge of the open grave. And then the corpse smiled, not a human smile. Not one of warmth or recognition. This was something else, something wrong. Its lips peeled back, revealing splintered teeth, its jaw stretching far too wide. A wet, sucking sound came from its throat, like it was trying to remember how to speak. And then it did a whisper, low, strained, not from the coffin, from behind me. "You let me out." The room felt smaller, the air pressing down on me like a weight. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Mang Lito took a slow sip of his drink, the ice clinking softly against the glass, but his eyes never left mine. I looked down at the crumpled paper in my hands, my fingers trembling. It was blank. No name, no signature, no seal, but I had seen it. I had read it. It had been real. Behind me, Nestor swore under his breath, his hands still shaking as he wiped the sweat from his face. His breathing was uneven, ragged, like he was barely holding himself together. I don't understand," he muttered. "We had the papers, we had orders, someone told us to dig." Mang Lito just shook his head. "No, Hijo." His voice was tired. "Something wanted you to dig." The words sent a sickening chill through my gut. I thought back to the cemetery, to the coffin sitting open in the earth, the thing inside watching. The way it moved, too slow, too deliberate, like it was waking up after decades of silence. The way its lips had moved, forming words it no longer had the breath to say. "Help me," I swallowed hard. "Mang Lito," I rasped. "What the hell did we let out?" He didn't answer at first. He only reached for a cigarette with steady, practiced hands and lit it, the flame flickering in the dim light of the room. The smoke curled around him, his silence heavy, as if he was choosing his next words carefully. Finally, he exhaled. "They say the dead rest easy when they're buried right," he murmured. "When the prayers are said, when the soul is at peace." His eyes flickered to mine. "But when someone dies wrong, when they go in the ground screaming..." He tapped the ashes from his cigarette, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "Sometimes they don't stay dead." A shiver ran down my spine. Nestor rubbed his arms as if the room had suddenly grown cold. But we saw it," he stammered. "The body wasn't old, it was fresh." How? Mang Lito looked at me and something dark passed over his face. "Time works different for the ones who die angry," he said. "For the ones who die afraid." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "For the ones who were forgotten." A lump formed in my throat, forgotten, left there, alone in the dark. I thought about those scratch marks inside the lid, the way the wood had splintered beneath desperate, broken fingers. The ragged nails. The shattered teeth. How long had he screamed before he realized no one was coming? A sickening nausea twisted in my stomach. Something had wanted us to find him, or worse, something had wanted out. I bolted to my feet. "We need to go back." Nestor's head snapped up. "Are you out of your goddamn mind?" But I was already moving toward the door. My pulse hammered in my skull, my breath coming fast and shallow. I didn't know what I was thinking, what I was hoping to do, but something inside me was screaming, louder than reason. The body had been sitting upright when we ran. The cemetery was quiet again by morning, as if nothing had happened. No sign of the open grave, no trace of the horror we had uncovered. Mang Lito made sure of that. By the next afternoon, the site was filled, the dirt packed down and a layer of cement poured over it. No headstone, no marker, just a smooth, unbroken slab where a grave used to be. We never spoke about that night again. Nestor quit a few weeks later, said he was moving to the city for better work. I didn't blame him. I almost left too. I've worked as a corrections officer for 10 years. I thought I'd seen it all: fights, riots, suicides, the things that break men in a place like this. But there's one thing that still keeps me awake at night, long after my shift ends. It happened in solitary confinement, a place where prisoners go when they're too dangerous for the general population, where they're completely, utterly alone. At least, they're supposed to be. It started with inmate 14,623. His name was Daniel Monroe, but we stopped calling inmates by their names a long time ago. In here, they're just numbers, just files in a system. Monroe had been locked up for over a decade, armed robbery turned double homicide. He wasn't the worst we had, but he wasn't a model prisoner either. What made him different was the fact that he was on suicide watch. We checked on him every 15 minutes, every single day. And that's when we heard it. A low murmur, almost a whisper. At first, I thought it was the usual. Prisoners in solitary talk to themselves all the time. The walls get inside their heads, but this was different. Monroe wasn't mumbling nonsense, he was listening. I stopped at his door during my rounds, peering through the narrow slot. His lips moved slowly, deliberately. A pause, then a response, his tone hushed, urgent. He was answering to something that wasn't there. The first time I reported it, the warden waved me off. "He's just trying to get inside your head, Carter. Don't let him." But I'd seen a lot in this place. I knew when something wasn't right. The way Monroe would tilt his head, nodding along, the way he'd shuffle to the side, clearing space on his cot as if someone else was sitting there with him, none of it was normal. And then one night I heard it. A second voice. It was Monroe. Jenkins, another officer, was with me. We both stopped, frozen, listening. The whispering continued, an exchange between Monroe and something else. The second voice was breathy, slow, almost amused. The kind of whisper that sent a sick feeling curling deep in my gut. Jenkins' face paled. "What the fuck was that?" We looked through the slot. Monroe sat cross-legged on the floor, smiling. "Told you," he murmured, grinning up at us. His teeth gleamed in the dim light. "He's real." Something about the way he said it made the hair on my arms stand up. I swallowed. Forced my voice to stay steady. "Who are you talking to, Monroe?" His grin widened. "My cellmate." I glanced down at my clipboard. "You don't have a cellmate." Monroe's expression shifted. His smile faded into something darker. "Yeah," he whispered, tilting his head. "That's what they keep saying." The complaints started soon after that. At first, it was just the usual gripes from the other prisoners. Monroe wouldn't shut up. He kept talking all night. But then something changed. It wasn't just him anymore. The others swore they heard someone else answering him. A prisoner down the hall refused to sleep. Said he saw shadows moving under Monroe's door, not just one, but 2 sets of feet shifting. Another inmate, one of the tougher ones, begged to be transferred. He claimed he saw something peering through the slot. Not Monroe, something else. I'd never seen a man his size tremble like that before. Then came the final night. Jenkins and I were ordered to inspect Monroe's cell just to prove nothing was there. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell, a damp, rotten stench that clung to the air, thick and suffocating. The second thing I noticed were the scratches. Deep, jagged marks covered the concrete walls, carving into the stone like something had been desperate to get out. Or worse, something had been desperate to stay in. Gashes in the floor, gouges in the metal cot. Monroe sat in the corner, his arms wrapped around his knees. His eyes were wide, bloodshot. He rocked back and forth, lips moving soundlessly. The light flickered above us. I stepped closer, my boots scraping against the cold floor. My breath felt tight in my chest. "Monroe!" His rocking stopped. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stared past me at the empty space near the door. "It's his turn," he whispered. I swallowed hard. "Who?" Monroe's mouth twitched. "He says it's your turn now." Then, for the first time that night, I felt it. A shift in the air. A weight, a presence looming behind me. The hairs on my neck stood on end. A deep, primal part of me screamed to turn around to run, but my body wouldn't move. A whisper, right against my ear, not Monroe's voice, something older, hungrier. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs, but there was nothing there. Just the empty cell and the flickering light. Just Monroe's smile, stretching wide as he whispered, "He likes you." I transferred to a different wing after that, where the lights were brighter, where the prisoners still had beating hearts. Monroe, he never spoke again, never even acknowledged anyone after that night. 2 weeks later, he was found dead. No wounds, no struggle. The coroner ruled it sudden cardiac arrest. But here's the thing. That same night, long after they took his body away, we still heard it. The whispering. We checked the cell. It was empty, but the sound was still there, as if Monroe had never left. Or as if he was never the one whispering in the first place. My shift started like any other. The dull hum of fluorescent lights droned above me, flickering every now and then like they were struggling to stay awake. The hospital's night air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic, a chemical sharpness that never quite masked the underlying hint of something else, something old, something decayed. The only sounds were the occasional beeping of a heart monitor and the distant shuffle of slippers against linoleum. It was quiet, too quiet. I've worked as a night shift nurse for 6 years. I've seen it all: grief, miracles, suffering, death. But nothing prepared me for the night room 237 refused to stay silent. It started at exactly 2:46 a.m. I was stationed at the desk, the soft scratching of my pen filling the silence as I flipped through patient charts. Then the intercom crackled to life, a weak, rasping voice, a whisper brittle as dry leaves. "Nurse, please help me." The pen froze between my fingers. I knew that voice. The static thinned for a second, just long enough for my gut to twist with something cold and wrong. I turned toward the intercom screen, my pulse quickening. I checked the room number. Room 237. My throat went dry. That was impossible. Mr. Albright, the elderly patient who had occupied the room, had died at exactly 9:32 p.m. I had been there when the monitor let out its final, unbroken wail. I had watched the doctors pronounce him, their expressions practiced but weary. And yet I had just heard his voice. A slow, prickling chill climbed up my spine. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe another patient was playing some sick joke. But something about the way he spoke, so raw, so frail, made my insides clench. With shaky hands, I grabbed the room keys and started down the hall. The dim, yellowish glow from the overhead lights cast long, stretching shadows along the corridor. The further I walked, the heavier the air became, thick with something unseen, something waiting. I reached room 237 and hesitated. The door was closed, the small window dark. My breathing had turned shallow, my pulse pressing hard against my ears. I turned the handle. The door swung open with a soft creak. The bed was empty. The sheets were stripped and folded, the IV stand pushed into the corner. The monitors were off, their cords hanging limp like severed limbs. The room smelled of disinfectant, but underneath it something sour clung to the air. Something rotting. I stepped inside. That's when I felt it. The air pressed in around me, heavy and electric like the charged silence before a thunderstorm. The hairs on my arms stood up. My breath clouded in front of me. The temperature had dropped drastically. Then the intercom crackled again. "Nurse Gregory, it's cold." My lungs locked. It said my name. A bead of sweat rolled down my back, but my skin was ice. I turned sharply, scanning every inch of the room, under the bed, behind the curtain, even inside the tiny restroom. Nothing, no one, and yet I wasn't alone. I backed toward the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed a logical explanation. A prank, a malfunction, anything but the gut-wrenching certainty curling inside me. Back at the nurse's station, my hands trembled as I pulled up the intercom logs. I scrolled down, my breath catching in my throat. Room 237 had called. Twice. 2:46 a.m., 2:49 a.m. My stomach twisted into a sick knot. "Sarah," I said, my voice strained, "did you hear that?" She looked up from her paperwork, frowning. "Hear what?" "The intercom, from room 237. Her expression flickered with something close to amusement. "Greg, room 237's intercom isn't working. Maintenance cut the power after Mr. Albright passed." The room tilted slightly. "No," I croaked. "That's not possible." She gave me a concerned look. "Maybe you need a break." I didn't argue, because what was I supposed to say? That I had just heard a dead man beg for help, that he had called my name. By 3:15 a.m., I was making my rounds, trying to convince myself that exhaustion was warping my mind. But as I passed room 237, I felt it again. A presence. The overhead light buzzed violently, flickering like something unseen had brushed against it. The door, which I knew I had shut, was now slightly ajar. A draft curled around my ankles, sending an ice-cold shiver up my spine. The air smelled different now. Pungent, decayed. I reached for my radio. My voice came out tight. "Sarah, did anyone go into room 237? Her answer was immediate. "No, why?" I swallowed. "Because the door was open." Because the stench of something rotting was seeping into the hallway, because I was being watched. I pushed the door open wider. The bed was still empty, the sheets untouched. But the heart monitor, the one that had been turned off, was on. Beep, beep, beep. My body locked up. The rhythm was too slow, too weak, as if someone or something was clinging to the last threads of life. Then the monitor flatlined. A rasping exhale filled the room, right behind me. "Nurse, don't leave me." My stomach dropped. I spun around, every muscle screaming to move, to run, to get out. But my body wasn't listening. I was alone. The air had changed. It pressed against me, thick, suffocating. My vision swam, my knees buckling. I stumbled back against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The door slammed shut. The heart monitor shrieked. And I felt fingers, cold, unseen fingers, brush against my wrist. The next thing I remember, I was outside the room, my chest heaving, my body drenched in cold sweat. Sarah was there, her face pale with concern. "Greg, what happened?" I pointed at the door, my hand shaking. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She pushed the door open. The room was empty. The monitor was off. Even now, even after everything, sometimes in the dead of night, when the hospital is silent, when the shadows stretch too far down the hall, I still hear it. The whisper over the intercom, calling my name. I was desperate for work. When the job at Blackridge Correctional Facility opened up, I took it without hesitation. Just a prison job, nothing special. But the pay was good and I had rent to make. The only thing that gave me pause, every single new guard quit after 30 days. No explanations, no warnings. It was just how it was. A silent rule. You lasted a month, no more. I should have asked why. My training officer, Greg, was a solid wall of a man, built like a tank, thick beard, no-nonsense attitude. The kind of guy who'd seen too much and talked too little. He showed me the ropes, how to patrol the halls, what to look for, how to handle inmates. But his tone, something was off, not the usual hard-edged veteran speech. It was more like he was warning me. He squinted at me during my first night shift. "You got a strong mind," I frowned. "Yeah, I guess so. Why?" Greg didn't answer. Just grunted and kept walking. At first, everything seemed normal. The inmates were what you'd expect, some loud, some dangerous, some just trying to survive. Then came week 2. That's when I noticed it, the whispers. They weren't clear, just faint murmurs, too far away to make out, but always there. They drifted through the halls like smoke, curling at the edges of my hearing. The lights flickered in the older wings. The air felt different in certain corridors, too thick, too still. Then came the worst part. The feeling of being watched, not the usual paranoia of working in a prison. No, this was something else. Like someone was right behind me, breathing on my neck. It was midnight. My shift had been uneventful, just another patrol. I was making my rounds near Block D, an abandoned wing left to rot after a riot years ago. It should have been silent, but it was. A voice. Low, conversational, like someone muttering just under their breath. I stopped in my tracks. "Hello," my voice echoed down the empty corridor. No response. I turned my flashlight down the hallway, illuminating rusted bars, broken cots, peeling paint. The air smelled stale, like dust and old sweat. But that voice, I wasn't imagining it. It came from cell 218. The door stood slightly ajar, the darkness inside absolute. I hesitated. My heart was pounding, telling me not to go closer, but I did. "Anyone there?" I whispered, stepping forward. Static erupted from my radio. A wave of white noise filled the hall, loud, grating, and beneath it, clear as day, a whisper. "Leave." I staggered back, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The whisper hadn't come from my radio. It had come from right in front of me. I turned and bolted, didn't look back. When I stumbled into the main block, Greg saw my face and just shook his head. "You heard it, didn't you?" I was still breathing hard. "What the hell was that?" Greg sighed. "That's why nobody stays." The next 2 weeks were worse. I'd wake up at night with the overwhelming feeling that someone had been in my room. My radio kept picking up whispers. Whenever I patrolled near Block D, I saw shadows shifting where there was no one to cast them. And the dreams, God, the dreams. I kept seeing the same man. Bald, hollow eyes, a scar running down his cheek. He stood in a dark cell, watching me. Each time I woke up, the dream clinging to me like a sickness, I swore I heard a voice whisper my name. I broke. It was late, past midnight. I was making my rounds when I heard screaming, not the usual fights, not the kind of yelling you hear in a prison. This was different. It was raw, wet, desperate, terror in its purest form, and it was coming from Block D. I shouldn't have gone. Every guard before me had ignored it, but something inside me, stupid curiosity or maybe just my own downfall, pushed me forward. I sprinted down the hallway, my flashlight barely cutting through the dark. The screaming grew louder. Cell 218's door was wide open. I stepped inside, and the walls, the walls, covered in scratches, long, jagged gouges in the cement, years' worth of clawing. The air was heavy, oppressive, wrong. The door slammed shut, and I wasn't alone. The air turned frigid, my breath coming in short gasps. A weight pressed against my chest, something unseen but crushing, suffocating. And then, just behind me, breathing. I don't remember leaving. I remember falling into the hallway, gasping for air, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold my flashlight. Greg found me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He already knew. I quit the next morning, like everyone else before me. I don't know what's in that prison. I don't want to know. I always loved hiking. There was something sacred about the quiet isolation of the woods, how the world's noise faded, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of earth beneath my boots, the whisper of leaves stirring in the wind. The deeper you went, the more it felt like stepping into another realm, one untouched by time, where the air carried the scent of damp soil and the quiet hum of unseen life. That's why, when my best friends, Mark and Lisa, suggested a weekend camping trip, I didn't hesitate. We had done it countless times before, exploring unmarked trails, chasing the thrill of the unknown. But this time, we found something we weren't supposed to see. The hike started like any other. The trees loomed above, their skeletal branches scraping against the slate-gray sky. The crisp autumn air smelled of decay, of fallen leaves curling in on themselves, of something old. We followed an overgrown path we had never seen before, one that seemed to call us forward despite the way the undergrowth clawed at our ankles. Mark led the way, his usual enthusiasm painting over the gnawing unease that prickled the back of my neck. Lisa and I followed close behind, laughing, chatting, pretending the woods weren't getting quieter with every step. The distant caws of crows had vanished. The rustling underbrush, the insects, the wind shifting through the branches, it was all gone. Then we found the clearing, a field stretched before us, hemmed in by trees that seemed to lean inward like silent spectators. Headstones jutted from the earth, crooked and forgotten, their surfaces pitted and worn. But what made my breath hitch was the way every single name had been scratched out. Deep, jagged grooves marred the stone markers, as if someone had desperately tried to erase the memory of those buried beneath. Lisa shuddered beside me. "This feels wrong," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Mark scoffed, but there was something off about it, something tight in his throat. "Come on, it's just an abandoned graveyard. Maybe vandals got to it." But even he didn't sound convinced. The air had changed. It was thicker, heavier, like stepping into a pressure chamber. And the silence, God, the silence. It was unnatural. The kind that made the hair on the back of your neck rise, made your instincts scream at you to leave. Then we heard it, a giggle. Soft, high-pitched, a child's laughter floating through the stillness like a whisper from something unseen. My stomach lurched. I turned too fast, my vision blurring, heart hammering against my ribs. The sound had come from the trees, from the fog that had begun to creep between the trunks, curling like ghostly fingers around the base of the headstones. Lisa's grip tightened around my arm. "Did you hear that?" Mark swallowed, eyes darting toward the trees. "Probably just the wind," he muttered. But he wasn't moving, then it came again, closer. A giggle, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps, light, hurried, darting just beyond our line of sight. Lisa pressed closer to me. "Let's go back," she whispered. "I don't like this." Mark hesitated. I could see it, the push and pull of his own disbelief warring with the primal fear creeping into his bones. But before he could speak, something moved, a shadow, small, pale, flickering between the trees like a mirage. Lisa let out a sharp breath. "Did you see that?" Mark's face had gone pale. "Yeah. I turned to leave, my pulse a wild drum in my ears, but the fog thickened, swelling around us, making the air feel damp and suffocating. The headstones seemed closer now, their faceless surfaces pressing in, boxing us in, and then I saw it. A headstone half swallowed by mist. The scratches were fresh, not old, not weathered by time. Fresh. Lisa sucked in a sharp, trembling breath beside me. Mark cursed under his breath. What the hell, then? A voice. A whisper slithering through the silence, cold as the grave. Run. The words scraped against my skull, not heard but felt. And we ran. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. My legs burned, my lungs felt raw, but I didn't care. Lisa was sobbing, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and Mark was eerily quiet, his face pale as he threw our gear into the trunk. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. I started the car with shaking hands, the engine's rumble breaking the suffocating silence. As soon as the headlights cut through the mist, I floored it, gravel spitting beneath the tires as we tore away from the campsite. No one said a word the entire drive back. The only sound was the occasional hitch in Lisa's breathing and the faint hum of the radio, too low to be comforting. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting, dreading to see something in the distance, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty road stretching behind us. By the time we reached civilization, the world felt wrong, too normal. Streetlights flickered. The faint glow of gas stations and diners cut through the night, life going on as if nothing had happened. As if we hadn't just. Lisa broke the silence. I'm not going back there. Her voice was hoarse, brittle. Mark let out a shaky breath, rubbing his face. No one is. We dropped Lisa off first. She didn't look back as she hurried inside, the porch light casting her shadow long across the pavement. Mark and I didn't speak until I pulled up in front of his place. He sat there for a moment, staring straight ahead. Finally, he exhaled and turned to me. You saw it too, right? I gripped the wheel. Yeah, he hesitated. We don't talk about this. I nodded. I don't know if it was fear or some unspoken understanding, but we never mentioned the trip again. I deleted the pictures on my phone the next day. Mark stopped bringing up new places to hike. Lisa started making excuses whenever we suggested road trips. We went on with our lives, pretending it had never happened. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. A soft giggle just outside my window. And every time I close my eyes and tell myself it's just the wind. I was exhausted when we checked into the hotel. The kind of exhaustion that sits heavy in your bones, dulling your thoughts, making the world around you feel just a little unreal. The road trip had taken longer than expected. Delays, wrong turns, an endless stretch of highway that seemed to loop back on itself. I could still feel the subtle vibration of the car under me, the phantom hum of tires rolling over asphalt. All I wanted was a hot shower to rinse the day off my skin and something good to eat, but as soon as we stepped inside the lobby, an uneasy feeling curled in my stomach. The hotel was old, its grandeur worn thin by time. The chandeliers overhead flickered, not quite enough to call it a power issue, but just enough to be unsettling, like a silent stutter in reality. The air smelled faintly of something floral, but beneath it lurked a hint of damp wood and age, as if the walls had absorbed decades of whispered secrets. The receptionist barely acknowledged us, her sunken eyes scanning over our reservation with mechanical disinterest. Her voice was thin, brittle. "You're in room 363, she said, sliding the key cards across the counter. Then, after a pause too long to be natural, she added, "Enjoy your stay." She didn't say it like she meant it. Our room was surprisingly nice, almost too nice, given the hotel's faded grandeur. 2 queen-sized beds, crisp white sheets that smelled faintly of detergent, and something else I couldn't place. A small couch sat in the corner, its cushions slightly indented, as if someone had been sitting there just moments before. The balcony doors were locked, but the view outside stretched over the city, a sprawl of glowing windows and neon signs blinking in the night like artificial stars. I had just kicked off my shoes, ready to collapse onto the mattress, when Kimberly tossed the room's service menu onto my lap. "I'm starving," she declared. "Let's order something." I flipped through the menu absently, my mind still clouded with exhaustion. The usual overpriced hotel fare, burgers, pasta, salads. But then my eyes caught something odd at the very bottom of the page. A single line printed in bold. Chef's Special, midnight selection, available only upon request. No description. No ingredients, no price, just those words sitting there like a quiet challenge. A cold prickle ran up the back of my neck. "What do you think that means?" I asked, turning the menu toward the others. Gabby barely glanced up from her phone. "Probably some exclusive dish," she said. "Like a VIP thing. Or maybe it's a test of courage," Julie suggested, wiggling her fingers in mock spooky fashion. "Like a secret dish only brave souls order." Kimberly grinned. "Well, I'm curious. Let's order it." Something about it felt wrong. Maybe it was the vagueness of it, the way the words sat on the page like a dare. But before I could argue, my fingers had already moved on their own, picking up the room phone. The instructions were simple. For special requests, dial 9. I hesitated, the plastic cool against my palm. Then, with a steady breath, I pressed the number. The dial tone rang once, twice, 3 times. I expected it to go to voicemail or maybe an automated menu. Instead, after the 4th ring, the call was answered. Not with a greeting, not with a name, just a voice. Flat, distant, completely devoid of warmth. "Room 363, it said. It wasn't a question. A chill slithered down my spine. Hi," I stammered. "We'd like to order the chef's special, the midnight selection." A pause, not static, not silence, just emptiness. Then the voice, utterly monotone, replied, "It will arrive shortly." The line went dead. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought surfaced unbidden, coiling around my gut like a warning. We shouldn't have ordered that. Half an hour passed. The energy in the room had settled into something lazy, almost comfortable. We were scrolling through our phones, chatting idly, the strange phone call nearly forgotten. A single knock, sharp, hollow, too soft to be urgent but loud enough to slice through the air like a blade. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. The others fell silent, their faces turning toward the door in unison. "That was weird," Julie muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "Room service usually knocks more than once, right?" No one answered. We were all thinking the same thing. I hesitated before standing, my stomach twisting with an unease I couldn't quite name. The hallway outside was quiet, too quiet. I pressed my eye to the peephole. Nothing. The corridor stretched out empty, dimly lit by the flickering overhead lights. Shadows pooled unnaturally in the corners, the air outside the door thick with something heavy, something unseen. I swallowed hard. Maybe they just left it and walked away. Hand trembling slightly, I slid back the lock and cracked the door open. The hinges groaned softly, the sound almost too loud in the stillness. And there it was, a silver tray sitting neatly on the floor like an offering. The metal lid gleamed under the hallway light, reflecting a distorted version of my face. I took a slow step forward. The others hovered behind me, their presence a tense weight at my back. Then the lid moved. Just the slightest tremor, as if something inside had shifted. Not from the breeze, not from my movement, something inside. A slow, crawling dread seeped into my bones. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Gabby whispered, her voice barely audible. My fingers twitched, hovering above the handle. My pulse throbbed in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, to shut the door and pretend we never saw it. But I didn't. I bent down, fingers brushing the cool metal. The surface was vibrating, just barely, like the faint hum of a faraway engine. I lifted the lid. The tray was empty. For a second, that was almost a relief. But then I realized the lid in my hands was still trembling, as if something had just scurried out. A cold, electric shudder ran through me like icy fingers trailing down my spine. I dropped the lid with a dull clatter, stumbling back. My breath came faster, my skin prickling with an unseen presence. Did anyone see that?" I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. Julie let out a nervous laugh, but it was thin, forced. "Maybe we should just go to sleep. This place is giving me the creeps." She wasn't wrong, but the night was far from over. Something had entered our room, and it hadn't left. At exactly midnight, the knocking returned. A single hollow thud. It wasn't loud, it wasn't hurried, but it carried a weight that sent ice trickling through my veins. I bolted upright, heart hammering against my ribs. Across the room, Julie groaned, pulling the blankets over her head. "Seriously," she muttered, voice thick with exhaustion. Kimberly, always the boldest, grabbed a pillow and hurled it toward the door. Go away! The fabric hit the wood with a dull flop. Silence followed. We held our breath. The closet door creaked open. The sound was slow, deliberate, a groaning protest of old wood shifting against the hinges. We all froze. The room was still, but something was different. The air was thicker, heavier, like the pressure had changed. My ears strained against the silence, then I heard it. Breathing, faint, measured inhales, just inside the closet. My fingers went cold, my body refusing to move. The sound wasn't ours. It wasn't wind. It was too slow, too intentional, too human. Gabby's voice barely broke a whisper. Is someone in there? The words barely left her mouth before I reached for my phone. My hands trembled as I turned on the flashlight. The beam wavered, cutting through the darkness as I pointed it inside the closet. Just an open space, a few hangers, an extra pillow stacked on the shelf. I exhaled sharply, my nerves still coiled tight. Slam. The closet door slammed shut on its own, rattling the walls. A sharp gasp caught in my throat. The others jumped, eyes wide, hands clenching the sheets. The room fell into an eerie stillness, but we weren't alone. We could feel it. None of us slept after that. Every time we turned off the lights, the whispers started. Soft knocking on the walls. Shallow breathing just outside our beds. The quiet, unmistakable scrape of something moving across the floor. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination. That exhaustion was playing tricks on us, but I wasn't the only one who heard it. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The lobby felt different in daylight, but the unease lingered. When we approached the front desk, the receptionist glanced up and immediately went pale. Her knuckles tightened around the keyboard. You ordered the midnight selection." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of something terribly wrong. A slow, sick feeling curled in my stomach. "Yes," I said. "What is it? Some kind of prank?" The woman shook her head. Her lips parted, but for a long moment, no words came out. Then she leaned forward, her expression stricken. "You need to check out, now." Julie scoffed beside me. "Are you serious? We paid for the whole weekend." The receptionist barely acknowledged her. She swallowed hard, lowering her voice. "That item was removed from the menu years ago. You were never supposed to see it." My fingers curled around Gabby's. Her hand was ice cold. "What happens if we stay?" she asked. The receptionist didn't answer. Her silence was more terrifying than anything she could have said. We didn't wait to find out. The air in the room felt heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. My chest tightened as I watched the covers on Claire's bed settle, slowly, like the weight of an unseen body had just sunk into the mattress. My fingers curled around the edge of my own blanket, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. The desk lamp cast just enough light to see the outline of the empty bed, but I suddenly wished I had left the overhead light on instead. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching and shifting as if they too were alive. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to believe it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but the sound of fabric rustling hadn't come from my bed. It hadn't come from the hallway. It had come from right there. I licked my lips, my mouth dry as sandpaper. "Hello!" The word barely left my throat before the sheets moved again, this time a slow, deliberate tug, like someone was pulling them up, covering themselves. A sharp, cold dread lanced through me. I could feel it now, not just see it, but feel it, something in the room that wasn't supposed to be there. The temperature had dropped, a prickling chill creeping over my skin like icy fingers tracing my spine. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I stayed frozen, my body locked in place as if even the slightest movement would make it notice me. Then the breathing started again. Low, steady, too close. I turned onto my side, eyes locked on Claire's bed. The sheets lifted, just slightly, barely an inch, as though something was rising. A shape. A faint impression like the weight of an unseen figure shifting beneath the covers. My stomach twisted violently, my entire body breaking out in a cold sweat. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, the mattress creaked. A sickening, deliberate sound. Like someone was shifting their weight. Like someone was sitting up. I sucked in a sharp breath, my trembling fingers clutching the blanket up to my chin. The sheets deflated. The weight vanished. Silence swallowed the room. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Sleep had become a distant memory. My nerves were frayed, my body running on pure adrenaline and fear. Every muscle in me ached from exhaustion, but the moment I closed my eyes, I felt it. That presence watching, waiting. That third night, I barely had the strength to fight sleep. The glow of the desk lamp cast weak, flickering shadows on the walls, stretching across the room like skeletal fingers. I pulled my blankets tight around me, curling in on myself, trying to ignore the cold dread in my stomach. Then the knocking, slow, deliberate. A sound that wasn't just noise but intention. I shot up, breath coming in ragged gasps. The knocking continued, 3 perfectly spaced beats. Not frantic, not uncertain, like it knew I was listening. My phone trembled in my grip as I checked the time. 3:00 a.m. A pulse of sheer panic shot through me, my fingers tightening around my blanket. Another 3 knocks. The dorm hallway wasn't empty this late at night. There were always people coming back from parties, walking to the communal bathroom, shuffling half asleep past my door. So why did it feel like the entire floor was silent? A suffocating stillness settled over everything, like the whole world had been smothered in cotton. I forced myself out of bed, every step toward the door feeling like I was moving through sludge. The peephole revealed exactly what I feared. Nothing. No one stood outside. A deep, crawling dread slithered up my spine as I stepped back, and the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't at the door. It came from behind me, from the closet. I spun, my stomach twisting, my pulse skyrocketing into something frantic and painful. The closet door was shut just as I had left it. But that sound, those same 3 knocks, dull and muted like someone was trapped inside. I backed away, too afraid to breathe. The air in the room had changed, charged with something unseen, something watching. My skin prickled as the hairs on my arms stood on end. The lamp flickered. A breath too close. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Claire arrived the next morning. By then, I was nothing but hollowed-out nerves and paranoia, my hands shaking as I tried to act normal. But the second she wheeled her suitcase inside, she hesitated. "Did someone else already move in?" My stomach dropped. "No." My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Why?" Claire pointed. Her bed, the one that had been empty for 3 nights, wasn't neat anymore. The blankets were rumpled, disturbed. The pillow had an indent. Like someone had been sleeping there. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. The dorm suddenly felt too small. That night, Claire insisted we leave the lamp on. We talked forced conversation, empty chatter, pretending everything was fine, pretending we weren't waiting for something to happen. But as the hours stretched on, neither of us could ignore it. That soft, steady breathing. The one that didn't belong to either of us. The strange occurrences didn't stop. They only grew worse. Soft whispers slithered through the room when neither of us was speaking, delicate and distant, like a voice carried on a breeze. Shadows stretched where there was no light to cast them, shifting at the edge of our vision, disappearing the moment we turned our heads. The air inside Blackwood Hall felt heavier with each passing day, thick with something unspoken. But the worst part was the note. Claire had been the one to find it, placed neatly on her pillow. The paper was yellowed and brittle at the edges, as though it had been waiting there for years. The handwriting was uneven, erratic. Each letter wobbled like it had been scrawled by an unsteady hand. "Don't let her in." That was all it said. Claire's hands trembled as she clutched it, her face pale. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Neither of us had written it. Neither of us knew who her was. That night, I dreamed of the girl. She stood in our doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of the hallway lights. I couldn't see her face. It was shrouded in shadows, featureless, empty. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching. When I woke up, a chill ran through me. Something felt wrong. The air was colder than it should have been, a damp chill clinging to my skin. Then I saw it. The closet door wide open. I knew with absolute certainty that I had shut it before going to sleep. I sat up slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The carpet was old and thin, but the indents in the fibers were unmistakable. Footprints. They started at Claire's empty bed, and they ended at mine. By the end of the week, we were done. The sleepless nights, the creeping dread, the feeling that something was always there even when we couldn't see it. It had drained us. We couldn't take it anymore. We went to the raw, voices shaking as we tried to explain the sounds, the shadows, the note. We didn't expect him to believe us, but we also didn't expect the way his face darkened. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply. "I'll get you a room transfer." No hesitation. Like he had heard this before. We didn't ask questions. We packed up as fast as we could, stuffing clothes into suitcases, shoving books into bags, desperate to leave. That was when Claire found it. Something wedged between the bed and the wall, barely visible through the dust. An old student ID. The plastic was yellowed with age, brittle at the corners. The name had been scratched out, violently, deliberately. But the photo, the girl stared out from it with empty, lifeless eyes. And in the reflection of the window behind her, another face loomed just over her shoulder, watching. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, a constant backdrop to the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors. The hospital air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something stale, an undertone of old linens and lingering sickness that never quite left the walls. The night shift had been uneventful, the kind that made exhaustion settle deep in my bones. My fingers moved sluggishly over the keyboard as I flipped through patient charts, my eyes stinging from the artificial glow of the monitor. Then a soft chime. I blinked. Room 306, evening meal request, chicken soup, crackers, and a cup of chamomile tea. The name on the request sent a slow chill down my spine. Gerald Mason, dead since last Friday. I stared at the screen, the cold glow reflecting in my wide eyes. My heart gave an uneasy thump. Maybe it was a glitch. The system was ancient, prone to errors. But my fingers felt numb as I canceled the order. Then the intercom crackled. Room 306, nurse assistance requested. The words crawled down my spine like ice. Slowly, I pushed back my chair. The hallway outside was dim, stretching out in sterile silence. Each step toward room 306 felt heavier, the air growing thick, pressing in against me. The door was ajar, just barely. Light from the corridor spilled in, illuminating the empty bed. At least it was supposed to be empty, but the sheets were creased, like someone had been sitting there. The next night, I made a point to check room 306 first. The bed remained untouched. No meal orders, no requests, nothing. I exhaled in relief. Maybe it really had been a glitch. Maybe my tired mind was playing tricks on me. Then Thursday came. The monitor dinged again. Another meal order. That same stale, cold scent settled in the air as I approached room 306. This time, I hesitated before stepping in. A breeze, impossible, given the sealed hospital windows, brushed against my skin. I wasn't alone. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. The thick, pressing awareness of something unseen, watching, waiting. Friday. A patient chart updated under a doctor's name, but Dr. Pearson had been off duty for 3 days. Saturday. The intercom crackled with static. A whisper slithered through the distortion. My name, Wilma. The sound was distant, fragmented, like someone calling from the end of a long, dark hallway. By Sunday, I couldn't stay quiet. I found Nurse Miranda in the break room, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. When I told her about the meal orders, the whispers, the impossible presence in room 306, she didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss me. Instead, she went quiet. Then softly, "Some patients, they don't always leave." My fingers clenched. The distant sound of a heart monitor beeping reached my ears, faint, coming from down the hall, from room 306. "Wilma," she continued, leaning in, voice barely above a whisper. "Mason was here a long time. Maybe he's not ready to go." I wanted to argue. I wanted to rationalize. But deep down in that dark place where fear breathes, I knew Mason hadn't left, and something told me he wasn't alone. I tried to let it go. I really did. I told myself it was just a glitch in the system, just a coincidence, just exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. I wanted to believe that. I needed to. But that night, I made a mistake. I stayed late. It was well past midnight when I finished my rounds. The usual murmurs of the hospital had faded into an oppressive stillness. No shuffling feet, no hushed conversations, only the mechanical hum of overhead lights and the distant, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor down the hall. The air felt thick, as if the building itself was holding its breath. As I passed room 306, I hesitated. The door was closed, perfectly ordinary, but something about it felt off. A weight pressed on my chest, urging me to keep walking. But my feet didn't listen. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity? Fear? Something else. My fingers barely brushed the handle when a sensation crawled over me, a slow, creeping wrongness. The temperature dipped sharply and a cold breath slithered against my skin. I stepped inside. The air was different in here. Stale, heavy watching. The bed was made just as I had left it hours ago. But the moment I took a step forward, a whisper of movement caught my eye. The clipboard. It lay at the foot of the bed, perfectly placed. It wasn't there before. My pulse lurched, blood hammering against my ribs. Slowly, too slowly, I reached for it. My hands trembled as my fingers curled around the edges. The paper was crisp. The ink was fresh. Patient, Gerald Mason, condition, stable. Dietary request, chicken soup, crackers, chamomile tea. No. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. My breaths came shallow, shaky. Then a breath, right against my ear. Cold, damp, real, a voice, barely a whisper, crawling into my skull like a sliver of ice. Nurse, I'm still waiting. My stomach dropped. Every instinct in my body screamed. The clipboard hit the floor as I tore out of the room, my shoes slapping against the linoleum. I didn't look back. As I fled down the hallway, the intercom crackled to life behind me. A soft chime. Room 306, nurse assistance requested. I transferred wards the next day. I told myself it was for the best. A fresh start, a different routine. But deep down, I knew the truth. I didn't want to be anywhere near room 306. I never set foot in that hallway again. Still, the unease followed me. There were moments in the quietest hours of my shift when I'd catch the faint chime of a call button over the intercom. I'd freeze, waiting, dreading. But the voice never spoke the room number. I convinced myself it was my imagination. A trick of exhaustion, until a month later. I was in the break room when I overheard two nurses talking. A new patient had been admitted to room 306. I told myself it was just another case, another name on the roster, nothing more. But then the night shift nurse mentioned something odd. When she arrived for her rounds that morning, she found an extra meal tray sitting on the counter outside 306. Chicken soup, crackers, chamomile tea. No one remembered ordering it. The system had no record of it. It was left untouched, except for a single spoonful missing. No one could explain it. No one wanted to. As I sprinted back toward my hut, my heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out the night's usual sounds. The wind had picked up, hissing through the dry grass and whistling between the tombstones. My flashlight wobbled in my grip, the beam bouncing wildly across the graves, casting long, shifting shadows. I reached my door, slammed it shut, and bolted it with shaking hands. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the wall, straining to listen. Silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, like the world itself was holding its breath. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, every nerve in my body on edge. I told myself I had imagined it, that maybe it was just an old candle someone had lit long ago, finally burning out. Maybe the knocking had been a trick of the wind. And then, tap, a single deliberate knock, not from the mausoleum, from my window. A slow, dreadful chill crept through my limbs as I forced myself to turn my head. The curtain was drawn, but beyond the thin fabric, I could see the unmistakable outline of a figure standing just outside the glass, tall, still, waiting. A breath too close, too real, exhaled against the pane, fogging up a small patch of glass. I squeezed my eyes shut, whispering a prayer under my breath. My grandmother used to say that the dead should be left alone, that the only way to stay safe was to never acknowledge them. My hands clenched into fists. Tap. I snapped my eyes open. The figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my chair until dawn, every muscle in my body stiff and aching. As the first light of morning crept into the room, I dared to check outside. Nothing, no footprints in the dirt. No signs that anyone had stood at my window. But when I glanced toward the mausoleum, my blood ran cold. The lock on the gate was gone. The doors were slightly open, and inside, the flickering glow had returned. The feeling of the sun against my skin should have been a relief, but it wasn't. My body still felt cold, like something had seeped into my bones back in that mausoleum. I walked back toward my hut, trying to convince myself that I had just let my imagination get the best of me. I had been working here for 10 years. Why would today be any different? And yet, the scratch marks. I rubbed my face, willing myself to push the thought away. Maybe the stone had cracked from age. Maybe someone had vandalized it long before my time. Maybe a sound, soft, barely there. A single footstep behind me. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. The graveyard stretched out in silence, the air heavy and unmoving. No wind. No birds. Just rows of stone and the whisper of dried leaves scraping against the path. I was rattled, that much was clear. I just needed to sit down, have some water, clear my head. I reached the caretaker's hut and stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The old wooden walls felt safe, familiar. I exhaled, rubbing the tension from my neck as I sat down at my small desk. It was then that I noticed the old photograph hanging on the wall, a picture of the De La Rosa mausoleum, taken years ago as part of the cemetery's records. I had seen it 100 times, never given it much thought. But now my eyes were drawn to something I had never noticed before, the doorway. There was a shadow in it. Not a trick of the light, not a smudge. Something stood in the entrance. I leaned in, my pulse picking up. Had that always been there? Had I just overlooked it? I reached for the frame, my fingers unsteady as I took it off the wall. My breathing slowed, my mind racing for a reasonable explanation. Then I looked closer. The shadow wasn't just standing there. It was turned slightly, as if it had just noticed the camera, as if it had just noticed me. A deep chill settled in my chest. I put the photo down, suddenly feeling like I didn't want to be in the hut anymore. The walls seemed too thin, the windows too exposed. And then, right outside, a single deliberate knock on the wooden door. I stopped breathing. Again, my fingers hovered over my phone, my mind caught between answering and ignoring it. Then, after a long silence, I finally stood up and stepped toward the door. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I reached for the knob, my palms sweating, and when I opened it, there was no one there, just the empty cemetery, bathed in the morning light. I let out a shaky breath and stepped outside, glancing around. Nothing. No footprints, no movement, just stillness. I told myself it was just my nerves. That I had imagined it. But that night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had knocked. And that next time, it might not leave. I wasn't supposed to be at the Grand Haven Hotel that night. My original booking was at a budget inn across town, a no-frills place with stiff sheets and buzzing fluorescent lights. But when I arrived, they had overbooked. The front desk clerk, all too eager to fix the mistake, offered me a free upgrade to a much fancier hotel. A rare stroke of luck, I thought. Looking back, I should have known better. My name is Fiona, and this story still keeps me up at night. I checked in around 9 p.m., exhausted from my flight. The Grand Haven was beautiful, ornate chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls, thick carpets that muffled every step, and hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly under dim, flickering sconces. Room 709 was mine for the next 3 nights. A perfect view of the city, a king-sized bed, and best of all, absolute silence. At least, that's what I thought. The first thing that felt wrong was the Do Not Disturb sign hanging on my door handle. I hadn't put it there. In fact, I hadn't even stepped inside yet. I hesitated, my fingers brushing over the laminated tag before pulling it off and tucking it into my pocket. Maybe housekeeping left it by mistake. Inside, the room was neat, untouched, exactly as I expected. I dropped my bags, took a quick shower, and collapsed onto the bed. Then, at 2:34 a.m., I woke up. Knocking. Soft, deliberate, 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. I held my breath. It wasn't loud. It wasn't frantic, but it was wrong. The kind of sound that digs into your spine, pressing you to acknowledge it. I reached for my phone and checked the peephole. Nothing. Just the long, dimly lit hallway stretching into an eerie stillness. I shook it off. Maybe a drunk guest. Maybe the wrong room. I climbed back into bed. The next morning, I left the hotel to grab breakfast. When I returned, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The air was stale, like the room hadn't been opened in years. My chest tightened with an uneasy weight. Then I saw it, my suitcase. I had left it near the closet. Zipped. Locked. Now it sat by the foot of the bed, partially unzipped. A slow, crawling dread settled in my stomach. I checked the bathroom. Empty, the closet, empty. I told myself housekeeping, maybe they moved it. I went downstairs to the front desk. "Housekeeping didn't enter your room, Miss Carter," the receptionist said, scanning the logs. "You had the Do Not Disturb sign up. They skipped it." I felt the blood drain from my face. The sign, I had taken it down the night before. That night, I triple-checked the locks before crawling into bed. Every light stayed on. I set a glass of water by the nightstand. Positioned my suitcase exactly where I wanted it. At 3:12 a.m., I woke up. Whispers, faint, muffled, coming from the bathroom. The air was thick with humidity. The scent of wet earth clung to the walls. My breath hitched. I sat up, straining to listen. Not just whispers, breathing, slow, uneven, coming from behind the bathroom mirror. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. My body refused to move. The door to the bathroom was slightly ajar. The darkness inside wasn't just darkness. It was wrong, deeper. A void waiting. The bedsheets shifted. Not much, just a subtle pull. As if someone on the other side of the bed was adjusting them. The side that was supposed to be empty. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I demanded to see the security footage. "You've been the only one in and out of your room, ma'am," the manager said, pulling up the logs. I watched. 7:50 a.m., I left the room. The footage sped up. The door stayed closed. No one entered. At 8:37 a.m., the Do Not Disturb sign appeared. One frame, it wasn't there. The next, it was, swinging gently as if someone had just placed it. I left that afternoon. I didn't ask for a refund. I didn't argue. I just left. But when I got home, unpacked my suitcase and reached for my toiletries, the damp smell was still there. And at the very bottom of my bag, folded neatly between my clothes, was the Do Not Disturb sign from room 709. I never believed in ghosts. That was until I worked the night shift at Blackridge Penitentiary. The prison had been operational for over a century, its walls steeped in history, riots, executions, and countless deaths. The air itself felt heavy, as if the building had absorbed all the suffering within it. The stone walls seemed to exhale in the silence, their very foundations groaning under the weight of time. Most of the newer guards joked about the place being haunted, but the veterans didn't laugh. They just shook their heads, eyes distant, muttering warnings under their breath. They never explained, just cautioned. "Never go near cell 13. I thought it was just another prison legend, until I heard the screams myself. I had been working at Blackridge for 6 months when I first heard about cell 13. Frank, an older guard with lines on his face that looked like they'd been carved by the things he'd seen, brought it up one night as we made our rounds. His boots echoed on the concrete floor, slow and steady, like a ticking clock counting down to something inevitable. "You hear it yet?" he asked, his voice rough like gravel, his eyes unreadable. I frowned. "Hear what?" He gave me a long, measured look, his tobacco-stained teeth worrying the inside of his cheek. "The screaming." I let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Yeah, right." Frank didn't smile, he didn't even blink. "At exactly midnight, you'll hear it. No matter where you are in this prison, the sound cuts through like a knife." He paused, his voice dipping into something colder. "You can try to ignore it, but trust me, you won't be able to. And whatever you do, don't check the cell." His words sent an uncomfortable chill crawling up my spine, but I forced out another chuckle. "You messing with me, old man?" Frank just shook his head and kept walking. And that night, when the clock struck 12, I understood. It began suddenly, slicing through the oppressive quiet of the prison like a blade through flesh. A scream. Not just any scream. This was raw, unnatural, a sound that didn't belong in this world. It was the kind of shriek that made your stomach twist, that ignited some primal fear buried deep in the bones. A man begging, pleading, his voice ragged with agony. It wasn't coming from one direction, it was everywhere. It rattled against the bars, seeped into the walls, clawed its way into my skull. I froze. Frank didn't even flinch. He just kept walking, staring straight ahead. Told you. The next night, I couldn't shake my curiosity. I told myself it was just a trick of the acoustics, that sound carried strangely in old buildings. But some part of me knew that was a lie. When the screaming started, I didn't fight it. I followed it. The corridors of Blackridge stretched before me like a hollow maze, the overhead lights flickering weakly. The air grew thicker, damp with the scent of aged concrete, sweat, and something else. Something sour and rotting, curling at the edges of my nostrils. I found myself in an abandoned part of the prison, the old cell blocks that hadn't been used in decades. I shouldn't have been there. The walls seemed closer here, the ceiling pressing down. My breath felt tight in my chest. The prison's silence was different now, not empty but watchful, as if it knew I was coming. And then I saw it. Cell 13. The heavy steel door stood slightly ajar, its rusted hinges barely holding on. The number was barely visible beneath the grime, but I could still make it out. 13, stark against the filth, as if it refused to be forgotten. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a primal warning screaming at me to turn around. But my hand was already moving, fingers brushing the icy surface of the door. I pushed it open. Nothing. The cell was empty. The cot was covered in dust, the walls cracked and stained with age. It was just another abandoned room, or so I thought. As I took a step inside, the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath fog in front of me, curling like ghostly tendrils in the dim light. The back of my neck prickled, every hair standing on end. And then the whispering started. A faint voice just behind me, hissing right into my ear. "Help me!" My body seized with ice-cold fear. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped over myself, but the cell was empty. The walls loomed around me, cold and uncaring, as if they'd swallowed the voice whole. But I wasn't alone. I felt it. Something was watching me. I stepped backward, my heart beat a frantic drum against my ribs. The shadows in the corners shifted, a movement so slight I almost convinced myself I imagined it. The heavy door slammed shut. The sound exploded through the cell like a gunshot, shaking the walls. The light overhead flickered once, twice, then died completely. Darkness swallowed me whole. The air pressed in thick and suffocating. And the whisper returned. Not behind me this time. Right next to my face. "You shouldn't have come." A cold breath grazed my cheek, something invisible leaning in close. My entire body locked up in terror. I wanted to move, to scream, but my limbs refused to obey. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the whispering stopped. The air lifted. The lights flickered back on. I was alone. The cell door stood open as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait. I bolted, my footsteps echoing wildly as I sprinted back down the corridor, not stopping until I reached the main wing. Frank was waiting. He didn't need to ask. He just looked at me, shook his head, and said, "Told you not to check the cell." I never did again. And yet, every night at midnight, when the screaming starts, I wonder. Because now, when I listen closely, when I really listen, I hear something else beneath the screams. A whisper, a voice, saying my name, and it's getting closer. After that night, the screaming became personal. It no longer belonged to the prison. It belonged to me. Even on my nights off, I woke at exactly 12:00 a.m., my body drenched in sweat, heart hammering against my ribs. My ears still rang with the phantom wails, as if something had lodged itself deep inside my brain, a sound that refused to leave. It wasn't just a noise anymore. It was a presence. The kind that waited. The kind that watched. One evening, as we made our rounds, I finally turned to Frank. I had to ask. "Who was in that cell? What happened to him?" Frank exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. His fingers trembled, just barely, not enough for most people to notice, but I did. "We don't know his real name," he muttered. "The records are gone." Gone. That word didn't sit right with me. How do records just disappear? Frank continued, his voice lower now. "But the older guys say he was innocent." Framed for something he didn't do. He swore it up and down, but nobody listened. I swallowed. So they put him in solitary, Frank nodded. Death row, cell 13, he screamed for help every night, begged, cried, pleaded. He paused, jaw tightening. Until he didn't. A shiver crawled down my spine. And then, Frank's eyes darkened, his gaze unfocused, like he was staring at something long buried in his memory. One morning, the guards went to check on him, and he was gone. I frowned. Gone. What do you mean gone? I mean the cell was empty. Frank's voice was almost a whisper now. No body, no sign of escape, just gone. The corridor seemed to close in around us. The air felt heavier, thicker. I forced out a shaky breath. So, he's still here. Frank didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply nodded. Guess so. I should have left it alone. I should have done what every other guard did, ignored it, moved on. But I couldn't. That scream, it followed me. It lived in my head, scratching at the walls of my thoughts, refusing to be forgotten. And so, on my last shift at Blackridge, I decided to do something no one else had ever dared. I brought a voice recorder. Not my phone, not the prison's security system. My own recorder. Something I could take with me. Something I could listen to later. I needed proof. At exactly midnight, I sat outside cell 13. The hallway stretched out before me, endless and empty. The light above me buzzed softly, casting long, flickering shadows along the cracked walls. I pressed record. And then I waited. The first few seconds were just silence, the steady rise and fall of my own breath. Then the screaming began, raw, gut-wrenching, a man's voice filled with terror. Help me! The sound burrowed under my skin, turned my stomach to ice. Please, he's here. The recording cut off. Static. A deep, grating hiss filled the recorder, drowning everything out. It crawled through the hallway, slithering into my ears, into my bones. Silence. A deep, endless silence. The kind that feels wrong. My hands trembled as I stopped the recording. My breath felt too loud, my own heartbeat an unbearable drum in my chest. Slowly, I rewound the tape, pressed play. The screams filled the tiny speaker just as before, but this time, after they stopped, something else played. Something I hadn't heard in real time. A voice, low, unfamiliar, right next to the microphone. You shouldn't have listened. My blood turned to ice. The radio on my hip crackled, static blasting through the speaker, louder than I had ever heard before. The overhead light flickered wildly, throwing broken shadows across the walls. The door to cell 13 slammed shut from the inside. The force shook the walls, sent dust raining from the ceiling. The echo of it rang down the corridor, so loud, so final. I felt it then, something on the other side of that door, something waiting. I ran. I don't remember how I made it out. My legs felt like dead weight, my lungs burned, but I kept moving, bolting down the hall, through the security gate, out into the open air. I never went back. But it didn't matter because it followed me. Even now, years later, I still wake at exactly midnight, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. And sometimes, just sometimes, I still hear the screams. Except now, they aren't begging for help. They're whispering my name. It started with an innocent shopping trip. Just a typical weekend spent browsing through boutiques and vintage stores with my best friend Addison. The city had plenty of them, some overpriced, some hidden gems. But this was different. We had been walking down Harper Street, a quiet stretch with charming old buildings, when we noticed it. A small, dimly lit antique shop wedged between a nail salon and an abandoned bookstore. There was no flashy signage, just a simple wooden plaque hanging above the door with faded gold lettering. Eldridge Antiques. I turned to Addison, who had already stopped in her tracks. Was this here before? She asked, squinting at the store like she was trying to piece together a puzzle. I frowned. I don't think so, but look at that window display. It's kind of haunting. A strange assortment of objects filled the window. A tarnished music box, a porcelain doll with one missing eye, and an old-fashioned clock frozen at exactly 3:13. Something about it sent a small shiver through me, but curiosity outweighed hesitation. We stepped inside. A bell jingled overhead, but it was oddly muffled. The air inside was thick, carrying the scent of dust, aged paper, and something faintly metallic. The lighting was dim, as if the store existed in a perpetual dusk. Behind a wooden counter sat an elderly man with deep-set eyes and weathered skin. He didn't greet us, just nodded slightly, as if he had been expecting us. "Look at this stuff," Addison whispered, running her fingers over a row of eerie Victorian dolls. "Everything here feels old, really old." She wasn't wrong. The objects in the shop weren't just antiques. They felt misplaced, as though they had been plucked from time itself. And then there was the mirror. A full-length, ornate mirror stood in the back of the shop. Its glass wasn't quite reflective. Instead, it had a hazy quality, as if it were showing a version of reality that was just slightly off. When I peered into it, I swore my reflection lagged by a split second. "Jessica," Addison said in a hushed voice, grabbing my wrist. "We should go." She didn't give me a reason, but something in her voice sent a ripple of unease through me. I turned to the old man, intending to say something, maybe thank him, maybe ask how long he had been in business, but his eyes, they were locked onto me, and he was smiling. We left quickly. The bell above the door gave another muffled jingle as we stepped out. The moment we were outside, the air felt different, lighter, brighter, safer. "That place was wrong," Addison said firmly. "We should look it up." I pulled out my phone and searched Eldridge Antiques, Harper Street. Nothing. No website, no reviews, no mention of it anywhere. Confused, we walked back toward the store, intending to check for an address, but it wasn't there. In its place was a blank, locked unit. The window display was gone, replaced by dirty glass reflecting the overcast sky. The wooden plaque was missing. The door, chained shut with a heavy padlock. I took a step back, my pulse hammering. No, we were just inside." Addison grabbed my arm. "Let's go, now." We didn't talk much on the way home, both of us struggling to rationalize what had happened. Maybe we had entered the wrong building. Maybe we had hallucinated the entire thing. But how could we both imagine the same eerie details? That night I had dreams. Twisting corridors, the muffled chime of a bell, the feeling of being watched. And at the center of it all, the mirror. The next morning, I woke to find a small object on my nightstand. A porcelain doll. One eye missing. The world around me seemed to narrow, the air thickening like unseen hands pressing against my skin. My mother's grip on my arm tightened, her nails biting through the fabric of my jacket. She was shaking, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Victor took a step back, his face drained of color. "What the hell is this?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. The cemetery workers shifted uneasily, glancing between each other as if waiting for someone to break the suffocating silence. The open coffin lay at our feet, its emptiness far more horrifying than any rotting corpse ever could have been. I swallowed hard, the taste of metal lingering on my tongue. My pulse pounded in my ears as I forced myself to look at the note again. The paper was brittle, the edges curling with age, but the ink, dark and deliberate, looked fresh. "You should have looked sooner." A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, stirring the leaves and carrying with it a faint, almost sickly scent, earthy, but laced with something else. Something decayed. My mother let go of my arm and staggered forward, her trembling hands hovering over the coffin as if she could will my grandfather's body back into existence. "No," she choked out, shaking her head. "No, this isn't possible." Victor swore again, his voice sharper this time. "Some sick bastard must have done this. Grave robbers, maybe." But I knew better. Grave robbers wouldn't leave a message. I forced myself to speak, though my throat was tight. "Mom, what does this mean?" She didn't answer. She was staring into the empty coffin, her lips slightly parted, her breath shallow. Her eyes flicked back and forth as if searching for something she wasn't telling us. Victor turned to her, his jaw clenched. "Ruth, you knew about this, didn't you?" Her head snapped up. "Don't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was something in her tone, something brittle on the edge of breaking. Victor's hands curled into fists. "Tell me you didn't." A noise cut through the tension. A low, dragging sound. It came from behind us. The workers turned first, their expressions twisting in confusion. Then Victor, Then my mother, I turned last, and I saw them, deep in the fog-drenched cemetery among the rows of leaning headstones. Shadows shifted. Slow, deliberate, moving in a way that wasn't quite human. A figure, then another. Draped in tattered funeral clothes, faces hidden in the dim morning light, they stood just at the edge of sight, unmoving. Watching. My breath hitched. My body screamed to run, but I couldn't move. Then, from the wind, a whisper. A voice I knew, a voice I had not heard in 7 years. "You should have looked sooner," my mother gasped, and the figures took a step closer. The fear settled into my bones like a sickness, slow and suffocating. My room was swallowed in darkness, the only light a thin sliver of moonlight bleeding through the curtains. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out everything, until I heard it again. A whisper, right beside my bed. "You should have looked sooner." My throat clenched around a scream that wouldn't come. My body refused to move, paralyzed by the unnatural weight pressing down on my chest. The air had turned frigid, my breath curling in thin, ghostly tendrils. Then movement, a shift in the shadows near my closet. My eyes darted toward it, and for a moment I could almost convince myself it was nothing, just a trick of the dark. But then the shadows stretched, spread. A shape forming tall, unnaturally still, its edges shifting like ink bleeding into water. My stomach clenched. The figure didn't move, but I felt it watching. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming at me to run. But my body remained frozen, trapped beneath an unseen force. A faint creak came from the hallway. I wasn't alone in the house. My mother, Victor, were they hearing this too? The air around me pressed in tighter, the unseen weight on my chest growing heavier, squeezing the breath from my lungs. My vision blurred at the edges. Then, my bedroom door creaked open, slow, deliberate. A shadow spilled into the doorway, long and distorted in the dim light. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice remained locked in my throat. The figure by the closet shifted, almost as if it were retreating. But the one in the doorway, it took a step forward. My breath hitched, another step. And then I saw it, the gaunt, hollow-eyed face of my grandfather. But it wasn't him. The thing wearing his face wasn't smiling. Its mouth hung slightly open, lips cracked and dry, as if the very act of breathing was foreign to it. The sockets of its eyes were too deep, shadows swirling in their emptiness. Then, in that same rasping whisper, it spoke again. "You should have looked sooner." And this time I felt it, something reaching for me, unseen fingers curling around my wrist, icy and wrong. I finally found my voice. I screamed. The weight of the night pressed against us, thick and stifling, as if the very air carried the breath of the dead. The distant hoot of an owl was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the cemetery, leaving only the rhythmic scrape of our shovels cutting through damp soil. Every sound, every rustling leaf, every shift of the wind felt too loud, too unnatural, as if something unseen was listening, watching. Victor's breathing was labored, his grip tightening around the handle of his shovel. My mother stood rigid beside him, the flashlight trembling slightly in her grasp. I could see the tension in her fingers, the way she clutched the light like a lifeline, her knuckles white against the blackness. Then, the dull thunk of metal striking wood. My heart clenched, not Grandpa's coffin. We had already unearthed that. This was deeper. Hidden, a cold bead of sweat trickled down my spine as we scraped away the remaining dirt, revealing a second, older coffin. Its wood was darker, rotted in places, the scent of damp decay rising like a whisper from the past. The cemetery should have records of this. There should have been a name, but we all knew. This grave was never meant to be found. Victor hesitated, his breath ragged. "Are we sure about this?" None of us answered. There was no turning back now. With shaking hands, we pried the lid open. The air thickened, the stench of rot curling into our lungs like unseen fingers. Inside, the skeletal remains of a man lay crumpled, his bones tangled in brittle, decayed clothing. His hands, curled tight in death, clutched something, A note. The paper was yellowed, stiff, but the ink had not faded. My stomach turned as I read the words, my pulse hammering so loud I barely heard my own voice as I whispered them aloud. You were never supposed to find me. The night seemed to still. No wind, no movement, just the weight of that message pressing down on us. My mother sucked in a sharp breath, her free hand gripping my arm. "Who is he?" she rasped. No one had an answer. Then, somewhere in the distance, a twig snapped. Victor's head jerked up. "Did you hear that?" We weren't alone. The shadows beyond the graves seemed thicker now, stretching unnaturally under the cold moonlight. A sense of wrongness slithered through the air, an unspoken warning settling deep into my gut, and then a whisper. Low, breathless, right behind me. "You should have left it buried." The flashlight flickered. I turned, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing. But standing there, just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, watching us from the darkness. A breath hitched in my throat. The grave was not the end. And we had just invited something back. We never got answers, just more questions that no one wanted to ask. The authorities closed the case, chalking it up to an unknown burial irregularity. No one pressed further. The cemetery workers refused to speak on record, and my family. We pretended like it never happened. We sold Grandpa's house within a month. My mother said it was too painful to stay, but I knew the truth. None of us felt safe there anymore. My uncle moved 2 towns over, barely keeping in touch. My mother refused to discuss anything related to that night, and if I ever brought it up, she'd just shake her head and walk away. For a while, life felt normal again, but some things linger. It wasn't ghosts or curses, nothing supernatural. Just that quiet, gnawing fear that we had seen something we were never meant to. That somewhere out there, someone still knew what we had found. The last time I saw Grandpa's photo, I was packing up the last of my things before we left for good. The picture sat on the mantel, right where it always had. And for the first time in weeks, I forced myself to really look at it. His face was the same. No changes, no eerie expressions, just a frozen moment in time, exactly as I remembered. Maybe the fear had all been in my head. Maybe paranoia had made me see things that weren't there. I exhaled, shaking my head, and turned away. But just as I was walking out, I swear, I could feel it again. That same prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone watching. The weight of exhaustion settled deep in my bones as I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the dim glow of my laptop screen. The air in my apartment felt thick, too still, too silent. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing was wrong, but I knew better. Something was wrong. I could still hear Thomas Reed's voice in my head, hollow, rasping, laced with something far worse than fear. "He's waiting for you." The words coiled around my ribs like a vice. The logical part of my brain fought against the rising tide of dread, grasping for some kind of rational explanation. A delusion, a shared hallucination, a trick of the dying mind, but deep down I knew it wasn't. 3 months, dozens of patients, the same words, the same glassy-eyed stares that never focused on me but on something just over my shoulder, something I could never see. I stood up, pacing my living room, trying to shake the feeling crawling under my skin. My own apartment, my safe place, felt unfamiliar. The shadows in the corners stretched farther than they should. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed just a little slower. The air itself carried a weight, pressing down on my shoulders like unseen hands. I checked my phone. 2:17 a.m. With a deep breath, I ran a hand through my hair and moved toward the kitchen. I needed something to do, something normal. Coffee, yes, something grounding, something warm. The second I turned on the machine, a whisper curled through the air behind me. "Ryan." My blood turned to ice. I spun around so fast my shoulder hit the counter. My breath hitched in my throat, every hair on my body standing on end. The room was empty, but the whisper, it had been right behind me. The lights flickered. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The rational side of me, what was left of it, insisted that I was sleep-deprived, overworked, that my own mind was betraying me. The air had changed. It was the same feeling I had in the ICU. That heavy, static-filled atmosphere that made every breath feel like it was being pulled through water. The presence, no, I refused to accept it. Not here, not in my home. I grabbed my coffee and sat back down at my desk, forcing myself to focus. Medical charts, patient logs. Anything but that. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I clicked through my hospital files, scrolling past names that now felt like gravestones. Mrs. Holloway, Robert Matheson, Angela Reed, Miguel, the teenage boy, and then Thomas Reed. The last words I had written in his file: time of death, 11:57 p.m. Cause cardiac arrest, last words. Ryan, he's waiting for you. I closed the laptop. A creak echoed from the hallway. I froze. The sound was so subtle, so quiet, but in that moment it was deafening. Like weight shifting on an old wooden floor. The only problem? I didn't have wooden floors. A slow, crawling dread settled into my stomach. The lights flickered again. My breath came shallow, uneven. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around, to look. But something deep inside me, some primal, ancient instinct, begged me not to. A whisper slithered through the room, chilling the air around me. He's waiting. This time, it wasn't just a voice. This time, I could feel breath against my ear. I bolted out of my chair, knocking it over as I stumbled backward. My chest tightened, my vision tunneling. I wasn't alone. The darkness stretched, deepened, thickened into something unnatural. My own shadow twisted on the floor, elongating in ways that defied logic. Then the power cut out. I was plunged into pure, suffocating blackness, and somewhere something moved. A footstep, slow, deliberate. The sound of fabric dragging against the floor, closer and closer. I reached for my phone, fumbling in the dark, my fingers slick with cold sweat. The screen illuminated just enough for me to see the hallway, for me to see. My stomach dropped. A figure stood at the end of the hall. Tall, thin, wrong. It was barely more than a silhouette, but I could see the shape of it, shifting, breathing, its head tilted too far to one side, as if it had broken its own neck just to get a better look at me. It knew I could see it now. The air left my lungs, my phone vibrated in my hand. A new message. From an unknown number. I swallowed hard and looked down at the screen. You finally see. My vision blurred with terror. When I looked back up, the hallway was empty. The shadows were normal again. The lights flickered back to life. The air was still. But I knew the truth now. I had spent my entire career trying to understand death, to ease the transition, to make peace with the unknown. But the unknown, it had been watching me back. And now it knew my name. I never believed in ghosts. Not really. When I took the security job at Pine Hollow High, I expected long nights of silence, the occasional busted lock, maybe some teenagers daring each other to sneak onto campus. Nothing more. But things change when you hear something you know shouldn't be possible. The school had always been old, too many creaking doors and humming pipes for comfort. But lately, there was something else. Something no amount of late-night coffee could explain. It started with reports of the school bell ringing at 3 a.m., a bell that wasn't supposed to ring. I ignored it at first, thought it was just paranoia from the nearby residents. But then the reports came from people who had no reason to lie, officers on patrol, joggers who ran past at the wrong time, and even teachers who swore they heard it in their sleep. So I did what any rational man would do. I stayed. I waited. And that's when I learned. There are things in this world you can't explain. And some doors should never be opened. That night, the school felt different. The air carried a strange weight, thick and unmoving, pressing against my chest like an invisible hand. Every step I took echoed too loudly against the tile, swallowed up by the vast emptiness of the hallways. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, flickering ever so slightly, casting just enough shadow to make my skin crawl. 2:59 a.m. I gripped my flashlight. The seconds stretched unbearably long. My breath came slow, deliberate. Then, clang. The bell exploded through the silence. A sharp, unnatural chime that rattled the very walls. It was deafening, reverberating through the empty school like something alive. My pulse spiked. My throat tightened. That bell should not be ringing. I turned toward the main hallway where the control panel was located. The screen was dead. No power, no override, just a black, lifeless monitor. Then my radio crackled. At first, just static. A hissing, grating noise that set my nerves on edge. Then, leave. The voice was barely a whisper, but it sent ice crawling through my veins. I spun, sweeping my flashlight in frantic arcs. The empty hallways stretched on, lifeless and cold. The rows of lockers stood still, yet something felt wrong. Then, a shadow, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. Down the corridor near the farthest classroom, a dark figure slipped inside. A sane man would walk away. I should have walked away. But something beyond logic kept me moving forward, each step feeling heavier, like I was wading through something unseen. The door creaked as I nudged it open. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing unusual, desks neatly arranged, the whiteboard blank. But then on the teacher's desk, I saw it. An old, dust-covered yearbook, open to a page filled with faded photographs. My stomach twisted. One face was circled in red ink, the name underneath smudged and unreadable. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. A fresh photograph taped over one of the old faces. It was me. A breath right behind me. "Run!" The whisper slithered into my ear, and I felt it. The presence. The thing standing so close I should have been able to see it. My flashlight flickered. I bolted. The classroom chairs scraped violently as I stumbled out, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long. I didn't look back. I reached the security office, hand shaking as I pushed the door open, the monitors. Every single screen showed the same hallway I had just fled. Except I wasn't alone anymore. Figures, dozens of them, stood frozen in place. Their bodies were wrong, hollow, eyes dark as the void, staring, watching me. The bell rang again. I ran. I ran out of that school, into my car, barely able to jam the key into the ignition. My breath came in ragged gasps as I gripped the wheel. I didn't sleep that morning. I didn't even go home. I drove straight to the nearest diner, sat in the farthest booth, and stared blankly at my untouched coffee. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The school bell had rung. The cameras had shown something impossible, and I had felt something real. By the time the sun rose, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't go back to Pine Hollow High. But how do you explain something like that? How do you tell your supervisor that you quit because of a feeling? That you ran out in the middle of your shift because of a yearbook, a whisper, and figures that shouldn't have been there. So I lied. Told them I had a family emergency and couldn't work anymore. They barely asked any questions. People don't care much about night guards. They just expect you to show up, do the job, and leave. The next night, a new guy took my shift. Some young kid, maybe in his early 20s. I wanted to warn him. God, I wanted to tell him to stay the hell away. But what was I supposed to say? A week later, I ran into one of the daytime janitors at the grocery store. He asked why I left so suddenly, and when I hesitated, he gave me a look. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. He nodded like he already knew. Then he muttered something that sent a fresh wave of cold through me. "They never let us talk about it, but you're not the first. And you won't be the last." I haven't set foot near that school since. As always, thanks for listening.